If the U.S. government decides on military action against the Iranian regime, how might we go about this in a way that achieves our own national interests, those of the Iranian people, and is consistent with just war criteria? That is the subject of this episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. Welcome to another episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, retired U.S. Cavalry Colonel and former instructor of the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College and prior faculty at the U.S. Army and U.S. Naval War Colleges. This series of podcasts introduces enduring lessons of war, not so much for those who study war as a profession, but for anyone who wants to fulfill their role as informed citizens in our country's deliberations about war and peace. No one starts a war, at least no one in their senses, begins a war without knowing what they want to achieve by that war. This fundamental idea expressed by Clausewitz is not unique to war. Beginning with the end in mind applies to any undertaking. Sometimes that end changes as reality meets desires, but before beginning any journey, you still must know where you want to go before taking the first step. So what would we want to achieve regarding any intervention in Iran? Regime change is an easy answer, but that would be short-sighted. If regime change is an objective, then what's the long-term end state that regime change is supposed to achieve? Another way of phrasing this is, what's the problem that needs to be solved? A consistent theme in the national security strategies of each administration in this century has been identifying Iran as the chief destabilizing force in the Middle East and Central Asia. Various issuances of the national security strategy identified the Iranian regime as sponsoring terrorism around the world, interfering in the internal affairs of neighbors, seeking to thwart Middle East peace directly and through proxies, proliferation of missiles and drones, and it pursues a program of developing nuclear weapons with the ballistic missiles to deliver such weapons throughout the region. Further, the Iranian regime not only pursues violence against other states and peoples, it denies the basic rights and freedoms of its people. Now, we've lived with this problem for more than 40 years, managing it as particular red lines were crossed to include isolated application of military force. Why then should we engage in a concerted application of power to include military power now? The argument seems to be that the Iranian regime remains committed to its program of exporting violence and developing nuclear weapons. At the same time, it's also making war on its own people as they stand up to that government and demand change. If we add the notion of duty to protect with the continued illicit behavior of the regime, then there could be legitimate cause to act. Now, this would meet the first criteria of a just war, a just cause. Another principle, right intention, is not the same as just cause, and we should pay attention to that from the very start of planning. We, and whatever partners we have in this, will be accused of acting for material gain, for example, Iranian oil, business interests, or revenge. The information operations from current negotiations through establishment of post-conflict peace must recognize these claims and take concrete and visible steps to show that the interests in regime change are to support the Iranian people's desire for freedom and to end the violence and threat of violence perpetrated by the current regime. We must avoid any indication that the intent is to secure oil revenues or to enrich in Western or Middle Eastern financial elites. Given current affairs, this is going to be a challenge. Next will be the clear understanding that this action is a last resort. Now, the ongoing negotiations with the Iranian regime, which may have ended by the time you hear this, should establish military action as that last resort. Now we can move to actual military operations. Again, we need to ask, what do we want to achieve? Now, this will determine the means and the methods we use to achieve that end. If the problem is to end Iran's program of terrorism and proxy violence and to end its nuclear weapons program, then regime change seems to be the most probable solution. This is particularly suitable if the duty to protect also applies. If, however, regime change is the operational objective, what will replace it that will end and not continue or even inflame the current problems? This raises the problem of proportionality, where the material evils of going to war cannot outweigh the material and moral evils of not going to war. But let's park that for now. For now, let's remember that we faced a similar problem, minus the nuclear weapons part, in Libya. At that time, NATO conducted a bombing campaign against the Libyan military and police targets under a similar notion of duty to protect. The regime fell, but the country has been plunged into civil war ever since then. We need to do better against Iran. The aim of warfare, again according to Clausewitz, is to disarm the enemy. The intent is that in so doing, we create conditions where we can exert our will unopposed. In the case of Iran, who is the enemy? Now, we've already determined that it is the regime, not the Iranian people. What, then, is the regime's primary armed force that keeps it in power? In Iran, it is not the Iranian army, but Iran's 150,000-man Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. Without the IRGC, other elements of the Iranian oppression, such as the Law Enforcement Command and its guidance patrol, commonly called morality police, would lose the backing they need to continue their operations. The IRGC, therefore, represents the most effective target for a military strike. In the current unrest, the IRGC and the morality police are operating close to the Iranian protesters, whom we wish to protect. However, the IRGC operates from a network of barracks, training centers, and facilities across Iran. Our military and intelligence services know the locations of these facilities and even hit many of them in our last strike. The purpose then, however, was not to destroy the IRGC. In a future strike, the destruction of the IRGC should be our primary objective. Destroying these forces and their facilities will have additional effects outside of Iran. These IRGC facilities also represent training centers for Iranian-sponsored terrorists and other proxies, as well as the planning, command, and control for many attacks by these proxy forces. Military action principally targeting and intending the destruction of the IRGC by attacking its barracks and other facilities away from protests and other masses of the Iranian people will also fulfill the just war requirement for proportionality. Some civilians will, unfortunately, be killed or wounded and property destroyed because they are in close proximity to those targets or the air defense and command and control capabilities we have to take out before concentrating on the IRGC. Other civilians will be killed by Iranian missiles directed against Israel and regional partners in our strike against Iran. So we need to take reasonable and prudent measures to avoid such harm, but it will be unavoidable. Now we need to address the probability of success. The current opposition by the people provides the greatest opportunity for success since the 1979 revolution. Destroying the IRGC may be enough to give the protest groups the opportunity to wrest control and topple the Islamist government, hopefully led by the army, which would assert itself as the protector of the Iranian people. But hope is not a method. The Iranian people need to know that we will help them, but not do it for them. For this, any kinetic strike must be part of a larger campaign centered on information operations and other special operations support. Now, this might include special forces operating with the Iranian army and civil military operations to assist in the direction of disaster response and recovery. There is one more criterion to just war theory, that of legitimate authority, and this is going to be a challenge. The action may be just, but it must spring from a legitimate authority. The United States must engage friends and allies in the region to get their support. Getting other regional powers, such as Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, may be easier than getting congressional support. Nevertheless, the President must get concurrence from Congress. He must make his case to the American people and their representatives in the legislature. In the NATO action against Libya, all Libyan armed forces were designated as targets. In Iraq, the Coalition Provisional Authority disbanded the Iraqi army and police, including the army elements who complied with our information operation to stay in their barracks or at home, and who were assured that they would be the center of a new Iraqi army. In both cases, this led to a power vacuum, distrust of NATO and coalition forces, and continuing civil war in Libya. If we use force to topple the Iranian regime, we cannot repeat those mistakes. How to do that will be another episode in the ancient art of modern warfare.